He kept fighting until he was mortally wounded, and by that time the situation was beginning to come under control. The 3rd Battalion of the 3rd Marines and the 9th Marines landed on beaches that were not so heavily defended as those near the Cape, but they had something else to worry about: terrain. The beach dropped off sharply in this area, and the boats could not come in and hold their position. The jungle grew right down to the edge of the water, which did not help any. Soon boats began to broach, and before the day was out, 64 landing craft, vehicle, personnel, and 22 landing craft, mechanized, were stranded. Many of them did not get unloaded. The 3rd Battalion of the 2nd Raiders was assigned to take out the Japanese on Puruata Island. The task was harder than it looked. The Japanese had dug in well, their positions were nicely camouflaged, and they were firing from rifle pits and pillboxes, and, as usual, they had established interlocking fields of fire. Guadalcanal had taught its lessons. The Marines were ready for this development. It was slow going, but inch by inch they combed the island, and as night fell they dug in and kept alert for Japanese activity. When morning came, they went back to the combing, and by noon they had eliminated the Japanese from Puruata Island. They did not take prisoners. On the first wave, more than half of the 8,000 Marines of the assault force got ashore, and the rest kept coming. In view of the sheer numbers of Americans, that single company of Japanese defenders did an astounding job of slowing down the Marines for most of a day. Those interconnecting trenches seemed to run everywhere. They had snipers in the trees and fallback positions for their machine guns. By 7:30 a.m. in the morning, the Japanese air attack that had worried Admiral Wilkinson was beginning to come in. The American Air Force had produced fighter cover over the beaches, but the Japanese sent down Zeros and bombers, using the usual technique of stalling the American fighters with the Zeros, while the dive bombers tried to work their way in. The result was a number of Japanese planes shot down, but some bore in to bomb. The destroyer Wadsworth was hit, and 2 men were killed, and 5 others were wounded. Japanese fighters came roaring over the beaches, strafing, but the Marines had been taught that the first thing to do when you stopped moving was to dig, and they dug. The strafing casualties were minimal. All day long the Japanese sent in air attacks, and for the most part they were driven off by the fighter cover. Occasionally a plane got through, but even then the results were not serious, except in one respect. Every air raid caused the stoppage of unloading. Twice during this first day the transports had to haul out and move into deep water to maneuver defensively. That meant the unloading was slowed down, but by the end of the second day all that problem seemed to be solved, and the supplies were ashore. The Japanese fought bravely all the way, and by the end of the first day the Marines had established 3 main defensive positions. The Japanese defense force, or what remained of it, had been driven back to a prepared position not far from the west bank of the Piva River, about a mile above the beach. On the map the Marine situation looked good, but in fact the Marines were in a dangerous fix. The terrain was virtually a trap. Except for 2 lines of approach to Cape Torokina, the land was swamp and dense jungle. Attempts to establish lateral communication created enormous difficulties. The jungle was so thick that the troops were lucky to push ahead 50 yards in an hour, whether there were Japanese in front of them or not. The Marines discovered that an old trail to a mission down by the beach led from the Vera River. The 2nd Raiders put up a trail block between the beach and the Japanese position up the mountain, and the unloading continued. On November 2, patrols went out all along the beach line to probe up the mountains. On November 3, 2 platoons from the 3rd Raider Battalion moved to Torokina Island under cover of a bombardment by 75mm pack howitzers. They found the Japanese had disappeared, and at this point organised resistance in the Torokina area had come to an end. The Seabees began to come in to build roads. Parties set out to find and bury the dead Japanese. They found 192 enemy bodies. The Japanese, who had retreated from the area, reassembled and counted the men of the 2nd Company, reinforced. Of the 270 men, only 78 had survived, and on the Japanese side that day there had been many heroic deeds. But there were no medals for Japanese servicemen. They were expected to die heroically for nation and emperor. In fact, the officers of any unit that gave up its position were subject to a certain criticism for not dying on post. But those Japanese of Torokina, which they called Tarokina, did not deserve the criticism. There had been just too many Marines and too much firepower for them to do any better than they had. On Guadalcanal and the other islands, the American troops had been sorely troubled by the Japanese ability to infiltrate or to remain silently in position as the battle surged past them, then emerge at night and raise havoc inside the American perimeter. At Bougainville, the Americans had a new weapon, the war dog, and these dogs were Doberman pinschers, long known for their aggressive dispositions. At Bougainville, they paid their way immediately by pointing out snipers and concealed Japanese positions. The effectiveness of the old Japanese techniques was reduced, and the worry of the Marines at night was lessened. On the second day, the beachhead was now established to a depth of a little more than a mile. Construction was to be the next step. First, roads and a fighter strip had to be built to make the island defences work. A bomber field site had to be located and then captured, and various supply dumps had to be located and protected from the air attacks that would be coming. Right now, the Marines had a toehold on Bougainville, and not much more. Admiral Halsey knew that Bougainville was too important to the Japanese for the landing there to go unchallenged. He suspected that the Japanese would counter first with an attempt to force a sea battle. Thus, as the amphibious landing ships set out from Guadalcanal and the newer bases in the Central Solomons, so did United States Task Force 39, 4 cruisers and 8 destroyers under Admiral Merrill. The ships sailed at 2:30 in the morning of October 31 to bombard Buka and the Shortlands and to seek battle with any Japanese ships that came down. Soon they were in the slot, moving northward. A Japanese search plane spotted them there that morning and radioed the word to Rabaul, and as noted, the Japanese had been surprised by the Allied landings. The landing in the treasuries had been so inconclusive that Admiral Koga had been unwilling to react. The landing at Choiseul was quickly recognized as a feint, and then it was apparent at Truk and Rabaul that the real landing had to be either on Bougainville or on New Britain if the Allies believed they could take on Rabaul at this particular moment. Still, Admiral Koga had to wait, but the Japanese counterplan was already in motion. It was the Roe operation, and it was a 3-pronged response to the Allied move, on land, on sea, and in the air. To prepare for Roe Go, the Japanese had been funneling planes down to Rabaul by the score. No American carriers except escort carriers had been reported in the area recently, and Admiral Koga, not expecting to use his carriers, had stripped them of many of their planes and pilots and added these to the strength of the 11th Air Fleet. With the word that the American Marines had landed at the treasuries, the Roe operations began. Admiral Koga sent a large force of cruisers down to Rabaul. They would escort the counter-landing force to Bougainville, and then seek battle with the American cruisers expected to come up from Guadalcanal. Admiral Sentaro Omori had arrived at Rabaul within the past few hours in the heavy cruiser Miyoko and with the heavy cruiser Haguro. They had escorted a large merchant convoy down from Truk. Having some second thoughts, Koga had also sent for Admiral Ozawa and the carriers Shokaku, Zuikaku, and Zuihobut. These were at sea, and it would be several days before they could reach Rabaul, thus for the first time in months. Admiral Samejima, the commander of the 8th Fleet, had at his disposal a force powerful enough to send out to do battle with the enemy cruisers. He prepared to dispatch Omori southward to find the American cruiser force and destroy it. Omori had the 2 heavy cruisers, the light cruisers Sendai and Agano, and 7 destroyers. The one commander in the whole force who was familiar with these waters was Admiral Ijuin, who was assigned to assist Omori. Ijuin went to the flagship on the afternoon of October 31 to confer with Admiral Omori and Admiral Matsubara, who was in command of the Agano and 3 destroyers. Omori had just returned from the homeland and was not up to date on battle tactics. Matsubari was not experienced in night fighting, which Ijuin knew was going to be a problem. At best, the Japanese would see the Americans before they were seen, but the American radar had proved to be a growingly effective curse to them. Matsubara's lack of experience could make a difference, but there was nothing to be done. Imperial headquarters was adamant that the Americans must be held in this area as long as possible to give General Tojo's government time to regroup its forces on the new defence line. It would have been helpful if they could have waited for the carriers to come down, but there was no chance of it. The American move had triggered Operation Row. The pressure was on Admiral Koga from Tokyo, and he exerted it in turn on Omori, and they were to get going and engage the enemy. The 11th Air Fleet was to put everything it had on the line, against the landing forces and the American air and naval forces. The 17th Army was to mount a land action. This would consist of a drive up from the south by the 23rd Imperial Army Regiment, less the 2nd Battalion, which was stationed on Choiseul, and a counter-landing near the American landing beaches on Bougainville. The land drives would be simultaneous, and the 2nd Regiment was supposed to link up with the landing force and drive the Americans into the sea. But once again, the Japanese army showed its appalling ignorance of American military techniques. The Americans already had 14,000 troops in motion, and nearly 3 times that number were expected. The 23rd Regiment troops available on Bougainville numbered about 2,500. The detachment of shock troops selected to make the initial landing was the No. 2 Ken Butai. The Japanese called these troops a decisive battle unit, and they were, in fact, commandos, and No. 2 Ken Butai had long years of experience in the China War. They were to be delivered to a landing point just east of the American position at Point Torokina, to assemble and attack along the beach as the 23rd Regiment came down the Piva Trail. They would catch the Americans in a vice. Just after midnight on November 1, the American ships were approaching Buka to begin the scheduled bombardment when they made contact with an unidentified plane. They assumed that it was Washing Machine Charlie, one of the ubiquitous float planes that served the Japanese so well during the entire Solomons campaign. 20 minutes later, Admiral Merrill's flagship, the cruiser Montpellier, opened fire on the Buka airstrip. If there had been any question earlier that the Japanese were aroused, it was settled then. Rabaul had the word in minutes. Admiral Samajima called Admiral Omori. He was to prepare to go out and do battle with the Americans immediately. The American task force bombarded the Buka bomber strip and several other installations. Just after midnight, a Japanese plane attacked the force, but one of the destroyers shot it down. A little later, the lookouts aboard the cruiser Cleveland reported seeing torpedo wakes and 2 small craft they believed to be Japanese torpedo boats. They did no damage. Shore guns also fired back at the ships, but these did no damage either. Several times during the night, Japanese planes came over the force, but the destroyers kept after them and drove them away. After bombarding Buka, the ships moved down to the shortlands to bombard the enemy troops and installations on Faisi Island and Poparang Island. By 7 a.m. the shooting was all over, and the task force steamed back toward Vella La Vella. Several of the destroyers were short of fuel, so they moved down to Hatham Sound to refuel from a barge there. Admittedly, the Japanese high command at Rabaul had been caught napping by the American invasion of Bougainville, but once the word reached Rabaul, General Imamura had swung into action. He had conferred with Admiral Samajima, and they had discussed the cooperation orders from Tokyo. So within a matter of hours after the Marines landed at Point Torokina, the Japanese were loading 4 transport destroyers with 880 army troops of the No. 2 Ken Butai. Admiral Omori's force sailed just before 2:30 in the afternoon of November 1, and the transport division came along a few miles behind. The Amagiri, Uzuki, Unagi and Fuzuki were supposed to reach the southern part of Gazera 1, Empress Augusta Bay, where they woodland their reinforcements. At that point they were supposed to meet the attack squadron that would cover their activity. In mid-afternoon, Admiral Merrill learned of the movements of the Japanese and set a course north to meet them. The first sign of trouble for the Japanese came shortly after dark. AB-24 broke out of the clouds and bombed the cruiser Sendai, but did not score any hits. Then came word from Japanese scout planes that a large American force was standing off Empress Augusta Bay. The planes erroneously reported 3 battleships among the vessels, and when Admiral Samajima had that news, he suddenly ordered the troop transports to turn around and return to Rabaul without unloading their troops. Admiral Omori was freed of the protective responsibility. His task now was to sink enemy ships. The Japanese were steaming through squalls, and visibility was just about 3 miles. That was a disadvantage already to men who would have to use their eyes alone to make contact with the enemy. At about 10:30 a.m., an American reconnaissance bomber reported to Admiral Merrill the sighting of a Japanese formation of 8 ships. Omori actually had 10. The pilot gave position, course, and speed, and then announced he was going to attack. He attacked the Haguro but did no damage. The attack over, the Haguro then launched one of its float planes, which soon found the enemy about 20 miles south of the Japanese formation. Admiral Omori then turned around to confuse the enemy about his position. That tactic worked fine when one was fighting enemies relied on visual observation, but for Omori this night it did nothing but waste fuel. The American task force was tracking the Japanese already by radar. Admiral Omori was confused by another report of many ships in Empress Augusta Bay. These were actually 3 American mine layers, escorted by a destroyer, which had just laid a minefield north of Cape Torokina. They then retired south, passing the task force, and further confusing Omori as to the number and sort of ships he was facing. Omori turned toward Empress Augusta Bay to attack the transports he had been told were just unloading there. Admiral Merrill moved his cruisers across the mouth of the bay to prevent the Japanese from entering. The forces grew closer and closer. Admiral Merrill knew precisely how the Japanese were coming and where they were. The big blips in the middle of the radar screens were the heavy cruisers, with the 2 lines of destroyers, each led by a light cruiser, on the flanks. The battle was fast approaching, and Admiral Omori still did not know where the enemy was. Admiral Merrill, for the first time in South Pacific history, was going to make classic use of his destroyers. They were to make a torpedo attack and then retire back beyond the range of the Japanese guns. Admiral Merrill would start the fight at ranges he believed to be beyond those of the Japanese torpedoes. At 2:31 in the morning, Captain Arleigh Burke's 4 destroyers slipped away from the American formation to head in for their attack. They were the Charles F. Osborne, Dyson, Stanley, and Claxton, and as they moved, Merrill turned around to get out of the way and let the second group of destroyers, the Spence, Thatcher, Converse, and Foote, have a clear field for their attack. Just about then, a Japanese float plane did Omori the service of dropping a flare over the American cruisers, and aboard the Sendai, Admiral Ijuin's men saw the American ships for the first time. Ijuin then ordered his destroyers to begin firing torpedoes on a right turn, and they did so as they turned. Just then, Admiral Merrill ordered his cruisers to open fire on the nearest enemy ships. The nearest blip of any size happened to be the Sendai, and she caught the fire of all 4 cruisers, which were firing by radar. In a minute, the Sendai was in desperate trouble, her rudder jammed, which made her virtually useless as a fighting ship. She began to burn. Meanwhile, in trying to avoid the sudden blast of cruiser gunfire, the destroyers Samidari and Shiratsuyu collided, and both suffered so much damage that they pulled away from the battle. Ijuin's order to turn saved the Japanese destroyers from Captain Burke's torpedo attack. The American torpedoes slid harmlessly by into the waters where the Japanese would have been had they stayed on the old course. The Japanese opened fire on the American ships with their guns, but the range was too great for the destroyers. The 2 heavy cruisers still had not found the enemy, and they were going around in a great circle. The second group of destroyers was thoroughly confused and milled about, following the heavy cruisers. The American gunfire was now concentrating on the heavy cruisers, and it was coming so close as to throw at least one destroyer captain into a panic. The skipper of the Hatsukaze tried to duck oncoming salvos by cutting between the Haguro and the Miyoko, and the Miyoko hit her, shearing off part of the bow and wrecking 2 torpedo tubes. So, half an hour into the battle, the Americans had set 1 light cruiser to burning, and the Japanese had damaged 3 of their own ships. Admiral Merrill had studied all the night actions of the past, and he could see that his problem was to avoid the Japanese torpedoes, which had always caused trouble for the American warships. To do so, he kept in constant motion, changing direction, so that no matter when the Japanese launched torpedoes, he would be somewhere other than the point indicated when they arrived. Moreover, with radar fire control, all the while he was doing this, his guns continued to work. However, they did not work as well at 30 knots under violent maneuver, as they would at a lesser speed that offered a more stable platform. The cruiser guns were not doing much damage to the enemy, and by this time about 3:15 a.m. Admiral Omori had finally located his enemies and was returning fire with his 8-inch guns. The cruiser Denver was hit several times and damaged badly enough that she had to slow down to 25 knots. Admiral Omori was trying to close the distance so his destroyers could work, and a few minutes later he seemed to have done so. The range was about 8 miles, well within the capability of the Long Lance torpedoes. Japanese planes did all they could to help Admiral Omori, and just at this point they were of considerable assistance. They dropped flares over the American cruisers and lit them up brightly. Admiral Omori continued to shoot with his 8-inch guns, but the Japanese gunners' aim was off this night, and they scored many near misses but few hits. Admiral Merrill began making smoke to conceal his ships, and Omori made the error so common in these night flights, confusing manufactured smoke with the smoke of heavy fires. He believed he had hit several big ships and put them out of action. Actually, among the United States vessels, only the Denver was hurt. Captain Burke's destroyers, which had charged forth so bravely to make the first torpedo attack, then lost each other in the night. It took Burke a long time to get them into formation again. The ships then approached the sinking Sendai, and they put some more shells into her as they passed by. Burke's ships next caught the damaged Samidar and Shiratsuyu on the radar screens, and Burke announced that he was going to start firing. But through a failure in communication, he got the idea that the ships ahead were those of the other destroyer division, and he did not fire, so the 2 Japanese ships moved off, safe. Commander B.L. Austin's 4 destroyers had caught the damaged Hatsukaze after her collision and had set her afire. Burke's destroyers came up to help sink her, and that 2nd Destroyer Division never did get off a torpedo attack because Commander Austin misunderstood Admiral Merrill's signals and got completely out of position. One of his destroyers, the Foot, ran smack into a torpedo that had been fired at the cruisers. In that mad manoeuvring of mid-battle, her stern was blown off and she skidded to a stop in the water. The cruiser Cleveland, coming by at 30 knots, just managed to miss hitting her. It certainly was the night for collisions. The destroyer Spence sideswiped the destroyer Thatcher. The Spence then took a shell at the waterline that effectively eliminated her from the high-speed battle. The battle ended raggedly, with neither group of cruisers ever really coming to grips with each other. The destroyers sank the damaged Hatsukaze, which went down without any survivors. Admiral Ijuin stayed aboard the sinking Sendai to the last, but almost miraculously he was saved along with a small number of men. He owed that rescue to Admiral Omori, and when Omori retired he sent a message to Rabaul, asking for a submarine to come to the battle scene and pick up survivors. The submarine I-104 did come, and did rescue the admiral, the captain of the Sendai, and 72 other men. Still more Sendai survivors managed to get aboard rafts and reach Bougainville. When dawn came, both Americans and Japanese were eager to be away from the scene, because both expected air attack from the enemy. The Japanese did put forth an enormous air effort, getting 100 planes into the skies over Empress Augusta Bay, but the effect of their raid was dismal. They managed to hit only the cruiser Montpellier, and the 2 small bombs wounded only 1 man and did little damage. Many of the Japanese planes were shot down by New Zealand and American fighters before they reached the cruiser force. Many more were shot down by the anti-aircraft guns of the cruisers and the destroyers, and from any standpoint, it was not a very satisfactory battle. Admiral Merrill had commanded with great skill. The same cannot be said for Admiral Omori, who never came to grips with his enemy. Captain Burke had launched a brave destroyer attack, but the 2nd Division of destroyers became almost as confused as the Japanese destroyer divisions. Considering all the ships involved, the damage done by guns and torpedoes was minimal. Inter-service collisions seemed almost as damaging in terms of ability to fight. Admiral Ijuin was unlucky to have his flagship in the van against the radar-controlled fire of the Americans. The victory this time went to the Americans for sinking 1 Japanese light cruiser and 1 destroyer. The Japanese lost about 880 men, whereas all the American ships made it back to base, and only the Foot was badly damaged. The Americans had lost only 6 men killed and 7 injured. Admiral Merrill won the praise of his superiors, and Admiral Omori was sacked and sent back to Japan to run the submarine school. Admiral Matsubara, the commander of the ineffectual 2nd Destroyer Division, was also assigned to shore duty. Only Admiral Ijuin came out of the battle with his reputation intact, but as for settling anything about the Bougainville invasion, the Battle of Empress Augusta Bay was a draw. The American beachhead was intact, and so was the Japanese naval fighting force at Rabaul. It would all have to be fought over again. The 5th United States Army Air Force had been hitting Rabaul hard for a month, with major attention to the ring of airfields around this important base. It was no milk run. The bases were ringed by anti-aircraft guns, and the fighter fields put up fighters every time. Japanese action and the weather were almost equal enemies too. Some days the raids had to be called off because of foul weather over the target. On October 27, when the Bougainville assault began with the landing on the Treasury Islands, General Nathan Twining's 13th Air Force lent a hand, but the 5th Air Force continued to strike Rabaul. On October 29, the bombers were there again, but on November 1, the day of the invasion of Bougainville, the bombers could not make the run. Weather again, and the next day, however, they tried to make up for it. The fighters and bombers tried to fly low to avoid detection along the way, but in St. George's Channel they encountered 2 large Japanese warships that opened fire with everything they had. So by the time the American planes reached Rabaul, the sky over the harbour was dark with anti-aircraft fire. Warned, the Japanese had put 100 fighters into the air that day. The fighting was fierce, and both sides lost a number of planes. The Americans, as usual, overstated the case, claiming 65 Japanese fighters shot down to 9 of their own fighters and 8 bombers. The Japanese said that only 18 of their planes were shot down, and Captain Tamichi Hara, skipper of the destroyer Shigure, claimed 5 American planes for his ship, plus a number of others badly shot up. But the most important aspect of the fight was that once again it prevented the Japanese from sending off the reinforcements to Bougainville. The Imperial General Staff in Tokyo had no illusions about holding Bougainville or even Rabaul for an indefinite period, but they had a timetable which involved shoring up the defences of the Inner Empire, and these southeastern area bastions played a most important role in that schedule. The row operation was designed to win that time. On Bougainville, the Americans awoke on November 2 to discover all was quiet. The Japanese had not mounted a counterattack. General Turnage soon saw that the Japanese on the west side of them did not intend to begin an offensive, so he moved the 3rd Marines to that side and transferred the 9th Marines to the west. The 3rd Marines had taken something of a beating in the landings, and the 9th Marines were fresh. The move was accomplished on foot for the most part, and there simply were no trails along the beach, and few anywhere on this west side of the island. The Marines were as secure as they could be on the uncomfortable beachhead. On their left, about 7 miles west of Cape Torokina, was the Laruma River, which was a fair stream. On the right flank was the Piva River, which twisted through the jungle, and behind the centre was the 840-foot Mount Bagana, the smoking volcano. On November 3, the 2nd Raider Battalion was assigned to take over the roadblock on the Piva Trail. For the next 3 days, action along the beachhead was confined to patrols, in which the Marines captured some papers and killed 13 Japanese. From the papers and the progress of the action, it seemed apparent that any Japanese reaction to the landings was going to come from the south. But the Japanese at Rabaul were having more than a little difficulty in moving the troops down to Bougainville to start a counteraction. At Truk, Admiral Koga received the news of the defeat at Empress Augusta Bay with considerable agitation. The setback put a big hole in his row operation before it had scarcely started, and the counter-landing was already late. Koga's next step was to send those heavy cruisers, a light cruiser, and 4 destroyers to Rabaul to prepare for a new naval strike at the Americans. These were followed by a pair of oilers and 3 troop transports escorted by the light cruiser Isuzu. However, the oilers Nichiai Maru and Nisho Maru were bombed by planes from the Solomons, and so badly damaged that they had to be towed back to Truk for repairs. This was a real shock. The loss of an oiler always troubled a naval commander. Even more than the loss of a capital ship, it was a reminder of the frailty of oil-bound warships. The heavy cruiser Chokai towed one of them, and a destroyer took the other. Then, on November 4, as the troopships and their escort were about 50 miles north of Kavieng, they were attacked by B-24s, and one of the transports was damaged so badly that it had to be towed into Rabaul. These forces were destined for Bougainville, but they were obviously very much delayed. When Admiral Halsey learned of the concentration of Japanese cruiser power in the Rabaul area, he was more than a little disturbed. What he needed were some heavy ships in a hurry. But there were no heavy ships for the South Pacific Command just then, because everything Admiral Nimitz could get his hands on was being used to mount the offensive against Tarawa and Makin atolls in the Gilberts, an assault scheduled to occur in just a little over 3 weeks. Admiral Halsey did have one card in the hole, although he could not be certain whether it would turn out to be an ace or a joker. He had been lent one carrier task force, Rear Admiral Frederick C. Sherman's Task Force 38, built around the carriers Saratoga and Princeton. These had been lent him for the first days of the Bougainville campaign and were supposed to be going back to Nimitz, but Halsey still had them. The problem was that American carrier doctrine still held that attacks by carrier forces on stoutly defended airbase complexes were to be avoided at all costs. The Japanese were thought to have 150 planes at Rabaul just then. That would classify as stoutly defended. Actually, they had nearly twice that number, but Halsey, who had been the first to try something new, the Marcus Raid, the Doolittle Tokyo Raid, was not a great respecter of formal doctrine. Furthermore, unlike a number of senior commanders, Halsey believed that ships were built to be risked in war, and he had no hesitation in risking them. So when Halsey learned that the cruisers Takao, Maya, Atago, Suzuya, Mogami and Chikuma were all at Rabaul, along with the Miyoko and the Haguro and several light cruisers, he gave orders to Admiral Sherman to make a strike at Rabaul on the morning of November 5. Sherman was to go after the cruisers first of all, and then the destroyers. He would be supported by planes from the Southwest Pacific Command, which were supposed to hit Rabaul around noon, but that didn't mean much. By the time MacArthur's planes got to the big Japanese base, the carrier planes would have won or lost everything. And if one looked at the figures coldly, the chances of their winning seemed slight, by speeding to the launching point and putting everything that could fly into the sky. Admiral Sherman was able to throw up 97 planes from the two carriers, 52 of them fighters. That meant 22 dive bombers and 23 torpedo bombers would go against all those ships and the fighters the Japanese could put up in a hurry. At 9 o'clock on the morning of November 5, Admiral Sherman had reached the launch point, about 230 miles southeast of Rabaul. That was a comfortable enough margin of safety in terms of gas, but that aspect was the only comfortable part of the mission. The American pilots did not really know whether Japanese ships could be found in the big complex that was Rabaul Harbour, but they were lucky because the sky over Rabaul was clear and blue that day, and when they were 50 miles out they could see the enemy ships, 8 heavy cruisers and 20 light cruisers and destroyers. It was the sort of target the 5th Air Force would have given some eye-teeth to have. The carrier pilots were even more fortunate than they knew, and a number of those ships had just arrived in port at 6 o'clock that morning from Truk. If there was anything they were not expecting, it was an air attack from carrier planes. Commander Henry Caldwell, the leader of the American air attack, recognized from the beginning that he had a special problem with Rabaul. The Japanese had many ships, and that meant all the shore anti-aircraft guns plus the guns of the fleet would be turned on the carrier planes. In addition, they had to look for a very large number of Japanese fighters right above their own major base. Therefore, Commander Caldwell brought his pilots in a large travelling formation, fighters on top, and this time they held the formation as they came in toward the volcanoes, passed over them and moved into the harbour area to bomb. Only at the last minute did the planes break off into small groups to dive bomb or go low and drop their torpedoes. The Japanese reacted too slowly, and instead of attacking the main formation when it was still outside anti-aircraft gun range, they waited for the formation to break up, and when it did not, they found themselves in the position of flying into their own flak. So the effectiveness of the fighters in stopping the strike before it began was minimal. The ships were caught unaware, one was fueling, But by the time the attack was launched, the shore and ship guns were putting up a hellish field of fire that the Americans had to fly through. The result was a scattered attack, and no Japanese ships were sunk. But that does not tell the real story. So much damage was done to the cruisers that they were withdrawn from the Bougainville operation. The heavy cruiser Mogami was hit by only one bomb, but it damaged her so badly that she had to be sent back to Japan for repairs. The bomb penetrated below decks and started a number of fires, and the major damage was to the hull, engine rooms, and one magazine. 19 men were killed and 41 wounded. The cruiser Maya took one bomb in the port engine room through her main stack, and she had to be towed back to truck. That remarkable delivery of bombs was made by Lieutenant Commander James Newell, leader of the Saratoga's dive bombers. The Maya's casualties were heavy, 70 men killed and 60 wounded. The cruiser Takao was hit twice, and a hole below the waterline on her starboard bow and damaged steering meant she too would have to go into dry dock. Her casualties were 23 men dead and 22 wounded. The cruiser Atago was damaged by 3 near misses, and the destroyer Wakatsuki was also damaged by near misses. The light cruiser Agano was damaged by bombs that knocked out her forward turret and wounded 11 men. The light cruiser Noshiro was hit by a torpedo, apparently a dud, which wounded 14 men. The destroyer Fujinami was slightly damaged by a dud torpedo, which wounded 13 men, and most of the damage was done by the dive bombers. The Americans were having a great deal of trouble with their torpedoes, aerial and undersea. In fact, for the amount of effort expended, the torpedo squadrons produced very little except when they were using bombs instead of torpedoes. The reasons were two: an inferior exploding device and a poor system of drop control. The following year, the latter would be remedied in part by development of control devices that kept the torpedoes from skipping or submarining when dropped at high speed at low altitude. Altogether, however, torpedo plane performance was a disappointment, and it had nothing to do with the skill or willingness of the pilots. Another problem on November 5 was that there were too many targets for the planes involved. As it was, the Americans lost 5 fighters and 5 bombers. They could thank the aircraft designers and builders for a number of lives saved that day. Many of the American planes arrived back on the carriers so badly shot up, it seemed remarkable that they got home. Lieutenant H.M. Crockett of the Princeton was wounded, but brought his F-6F fighter back to the carrier and landed. The Airedales, aircraft handlers, counted 200 holes in the aircraft. Commander Caldwell, who directed the operation from above, was attacked by Zeros. One of his crewmen was killed and the other wounded, and his gun turret went out, so did the radio, and one aileron, the flaps, and one wheel. Still, he got their torpedo bomber back to the Saratoga. As to the attack, from the Japanese point of view, it had completely destroyed a major effort to shore up the defense of Rabaul. As the Imperial General Staff's history noted, for some reason, the southeast area reinforcements efficiency was lacking. That same day, since many of the ships had not been in port for 24 hours, the force was withdrawn to Truk, and again, in the words of the Imperial General Staff, no profit resulted. The Japanese that day attempted to recoup somewhat, at least by getting at the carriers. The 11th Air Fleet sent out a number of torpedo bombers, but they did not find the American carriers. Instead, they found a small force consisting of PT-167 landing craft, infantry 70, and tank landing craft 68 on their way south from the Torokina beachhead. The Japanese planes attacked and damaged the ships, but did not sink any of them, because the vessels were so small the torpedoes passed under their keels. The landing craft infantry had the unique experience of having a porpoising torpedo bounce into the engine room and still not explode. One man was killed by the impact, but the torpedo sat there smoking and still not exploding. The men of the landing craft, infantry abandoned ship, but when the ship remained afloat eventually, they reclaimed her and got her back under tow to Torokina. The Japanese pilots who returned to Rabaul from this action claimed to have sunk one carrier and set fire to a second, which sank later. They also claimed 2 heavy cruisers and 1 light cruiser and a destroyer. These claims are not mentioned in the official Japanese history of the war because there was not a shred of truth to them. The American pilots were prone to exaggeration in the heat of the moment, but at no time did they ever claim so much when so little had been accomplished. Those torpedo bombers had not even sunk a rowboat and had lost at least 2 of their number in the one-sided fight against 3 small craft. When the results of the Rabaul strike were in, Admiral Sherman could announce that he had accomplished all this with the loss of only 10 planes. Admiral Halsey was delighted. He had expected heavy losses and had also put those carriers at risk by moving them so close to Rabaul. The gamble had paid off magnificently. Admiral Koga had been planning to use those heavy ships to break up the Torokina landing. He had nothing left that he wanted to risk, and by the time he thought it over more, the Gilbert's landing was in progress, and he had a third major front to worry about. Just because Operation Roe had suffered a serious reverse did not mean that Admiral Koga had given up, or that the Southeast Area Command was surrendering Bougainville without a fight. On November 2, after the counter-landing force had to turn back on the eve of the Battle of Empress Augusta Bay, 6th Division Headquarters sent a message to the 23rd Infantry at Moshiguta on the southwest side of Bougainville, ordering the immediate relief of the small garrison at Torokina. Based on these orders, Colonel Shunaki Hamanue, the commander of the 23rd Regiment, decided to lead a detachment to arrive on the west side of the island not later than the afternoon of November 6. Altogether, he had about 2,400 troops, but this initial detachment consisted of about 300 riflemen with artillery and machine gun squads. That included knee mortars, 18 of them with 10 grenade rounds each, light and heavy machine guns. Each heavy machine gun had 7,400 rounds of ammunition, and artillery that ranged from 75mm pack howitzers to 37mm guns. When the rescue operation was set up, it was planned that there would be plenty of supplies for these troops. The Army engineers had 4 Daihatsu barges in the area, and 5 days' supplies could be brought up on these. But on the morning of November 4, Allied planes found the Daihatsus and strafed them, rendering all 4 hors de combat. The troops would have to go into battle with a prayer and 2.5 days of iron rations. That wasn't going to stop them. The colonel entrusted the regimental colours to those left behind and set out. They were harried all the way along by urgent messages from the 18th Area Army through the 17th Army, through the 23rd Regiment, through the 6th Division, urging them to hurry and get into battle to save the Torokina detachment. It was as if this little detachment was responsible for the Torokina outpost being left out there on the vine in the first place. 18th Army Headquarters staff officers, looking at their small-scale maps far away at Rabaul, somehow had the idea they ought to get into position to attack on the morning of November 6 at dawn. Obviously, these Japanese staff officers had never climbed through the Bougainville jungle. The beautiful spiky vine named for the island was just one of the hazards of foot travel. The loss of time in the destruction of the Daihatsus and the problems of assembling such a striking force so quickly had brought delays, and there was really nothing that could be done about it, in spite of the radioed urging of the various headquarters. From 6th Division Headquarters came a message giving the detachment its battle plan. The enemy main force had concentrated at 4 o'clock on November 4 on the right bank of the Jaba River. By going overland northwest along the Jaba, the Japanese troops would find Noboi 9 miles away. To hit the enemy, they could depend on firepower from heavy weapons aboard its small boats. After reaching this point, the troops were to head for Point Torokina, which was about 4 miles to the northeast. They would advance to the Peku vicinity and wait there. The attack would begin at dawn on November 6. It was very important that 1 platoon of the 1st Battalion move to Jaba and advance along the Noboi-Peku road to Peku, there meet the Torokina Defence Detachment and scout the enemy camp. Specifically, the infantry of the 1st Battalion on November 5 was to advance down the Jaba to the Piva River, where the small boat force would be on the right bank. The infantrymen were then to land behind the enemy and make a surprise attack from the rear. The Hamanu detachment moved as quickly as possible, but that road mentioned in the orders simply did not exist. They found themselves slogging through the deep rainforest with its jungle growth toward the seacoast. They stumbled along through hip-deep water, crossing small streams and swamps. When they got to the mouth of the Jaba River, they discovered it was very deep, and crocodiles appeared and disappeared on the banks and in the water. The colonel ordered the men into the water to swim across, but one of the first men to put his foot in ran into trouble. A log moved, there was a small splash, and then a large one, a scream. The water turned pink for a moment, and then the swirls disappeared as the crocodile dragged its prey to the bottom. Fighting the enemy was one thing, but being eaten by crocodiles was something else, and the troops balked at trying to ford the river. The engineers came to the rescue with rubber boats and ferried the men of the unit across. Next came the crossing of the Kurogi River, which once more they found to be too deep to ford, and again the boats were employed. By this time darkness had fallen, and they moved through the blackness, stumbling and sliding, until at 10 o'clock they reached Noboi village on the right bank of the Kurogi River and sank down, exhausted. At dawn the seashore was clearly indicated by the captive balloons that the Americans were flying above their bridgehead to discourage Japanese strafing. The air was full of American planes, orbiting around the beachhead, and every time the unit moved they got strafed. Finally they gave up attempts to move forward for the moment. At this stage Colonel Hamanue was not at all confident of the success of the coming assault. Events certainly bore out his feelings of concern. Colonel Hamanue was to await the coming of reinforcements before launching his attack. They were to arrive early on the morning of November 6 by sea, and these were the first 1,000 troops of the counter-landing force. Another 2,000 men would come along later, and this detachment was the No. 2 Ken Butai, that unit of shock troops with long experience on the China front. They were the troops scheduled to land on November 1, who had been turned back by order of Admiral Samejima when the Omori force discovered the presence of what the Admiral thought was a very powerful American fleet. The No. 2 Ken Butai had returned to Rabaul at that time. In fact, they were lucky because no one had told the officers where they were going or what they were going to do, and they were brand new in the South Pacific. The commander Major Mitsuhiro Miwa and his officers took the next few days for intensive training in the tactics of jungle warfare, which gave the men a new confidence. On November 5, the orders had come again: board the destroyer transports and prepare to land on Bougainville. The plan was precisely the same as the last one, but on November 5, Admiral Samejima made a change in the destroyer command, a result of the poor performance of the destroyers at Empress Augusta Bay. So the move was again delayed. The attack was to be at night on November 6, but then the word came from Bougainville that Colonel Hamanu's force was being eaten by crocodiles and otherwise delayed, and so the attack was again postponed. The No. 2 Ken Butai finally boarded the destroyers on the morning of November 6 and sailed from Rabaul at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Lieutenant Colonel Hisano of the staff of the 8th Area Army went along as liaison officer with the Navy. They would land that night and attack at dawn. As it turned out, the destroyers did not reach Bougainville until the early hours of the morning, and then the destroyer commander decided he would lie offshore about 2 miles. He had been involved in the Kolom Bangara reinforcement operations, and that was the way they did it there. But a reinforcement of friendly troops and a landing on an enemy beach were 2 different matters, and the army men protested that they were being thrown to the wolves. This meant more discussions before the destroyers finally moved in a little closer, so much for inter-service cooperation. Lieutenant Colonel Hisano watched anxiously through his field glasses as the landing boats moved off toward the beach. Only when the signal flare that showed a safe landing went up did he relax. He sent a message then to 8th Area Army Headquarters at Rabaul, announcing the safe landing of the troops. At Rabaul, when the message was received, General Imamura heaved a sigh of relief, gave thanks to the Emperor, and sent a message to Imperial General Headquarters, but from that moment on, radio contact with the detachment was spotty. At 7 a.m. on November 7, the Navy reported that the landing seemed to be successful, but the landing force still had not been heard from. By 5 o'clock in the evening, the detachment still had not been heard from. The first word came through a radio intercept. At 8:35 p.m., an American message was picked up, reporting that the enemy was on the left, and that about 15 Daihatsus had been seen on the northern beach near the mouth of the Rovuma River. The message requested an immediate airstrike. After that, nothing. The No. 2 Ken Butai landed in 3 sections. The main force of about 650 men landed near the east bank of the Kurumu River. The second group, the 5th Company of the 54th Infantry, about 100 men in all, landed near the Keiki River's west bank. The 6th Company of the 54th Infantry, 100 men with a field gun and 2 machine guns, landed near the Kuko Stream. Major Miwa directed the landing energetically and then went off to join the main force. The three forces never did get back together again, and almost immediately, following orders, the No. 2 Ken Butai rushed in to stage a surprise attack. On the American side, the 4 Japanese destroyers were seen coming in, and landing craft were seen to debark and begin to load men, and then come into shore just east of the Laruma River. They were seen, but since warships in the dark look the same even to Navy men, and American landing craft and Japanese landing craft looked much alike, no one paid attention until it was too late to stop them from getting ashore. But in the hurry to get ashore, the Japanese scattered over a wide section of the beach. They also ran into the problem that had bothered the Marines in the first landing, swamp and jungle. Thus they could not immediately concentrate their forces for attack. Company K of the 9th Marines was holding this flank, dug in between swamp and sea. One platoon was patrolling upland along the Laruma River. The Marines saw about 50 troops landing from 2 boats, some 400 yards away. But what was happening did not sink in for a few minutes, and then the Japanese attacked. The Marines drove them off. The Japanese moved into the swamp and disappeared. When Lieutenant Colonel Walter Asmuth, Jr., commander of the 9th Marines 3rd Battalion, got the message about the attack, he ordered Company K to counterattack, and called also for mortar and artillery support. The Marines attacked at 8:20 a.m. and moved west about 150 yards before they ran into the Japanese, who had already dug in. The Japanese had light and heavy machine guns, and soon they had the left platoon of Company K pinned down. The centre and right platoons tried to come around and encircle the Japanese, but they were slowed down by the same thick jungle that had given Colonel Hamanue's men such a hard time. The Marine advance wasn't helped by the fact that in some rearrangement of the perimeter, other Marines had left entrenched positions that the Japanese now occupied. The Japanese ashore gave fire cover to more troops who came ashore in landing craft, and soon they had all 3 platoons of Company K pinned down. The fighting then slowed to a sharpshooting match. 5 Marines were killed and 13 wounded by 1:15 p.m., when the 1st Battalion of the 3rd Marines was ordered to attack, and the mauled Company K was withdrawn. The fighting now became a slugging match, and the Marines advanced foot by foot behind grenades, machine gun fire, and mortars. The Japanese threw the grenades back sometimes and added their own knee mortar shells. The Japanese machine gunners gave ground slowly and reluctantly, one gun covering another. Sergeant Herbert J. Thomas of Company B saw that his squad was held up by a Japanese machine gun. He gathered the men and told them what he was going to do, and he would get up and throw a grenade into the machine gun nest. The men were to wait for the explosion and then pour small arms fire into the position. But when Thomas threw his grenade, it arched too high, got caught in a vine hanging from the trees above, and fell down among the Marines. Thomas leaped forward and smothered the grenade with his body as it exploded, thus saving the lives of at least most of his squad. For that his family received his posthumous Congressional Medal of Honor.